Every week we've been sharing fun facts about Tim, and this week we'll share that for many of us, coffee is our favorite and a very important part of our days. Tim drinks none of it, but he is an avid tea drinker. And it's been known that he carries around his own big bag of teas. And if you're curious, his favorite teas tend to be Chinese black teas, specifically Hao Ya A. Not B, Hao Ya A. All right, so that's a fun fact about our speaker tonight. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Timothy Keller.
Okay. The very first week when we met, I tried to set things up for this entire series, and I think I need to at least refer to it each week because I don't expect everybody can be here every week or watch it every week. But we said the first week that there's no totally absolute way to prove that there is a God. There's also no way to completely, demonstrably prove that there is no God. And therefore, in a sense, everybody's living by faith. And secularism, I said, even secularism, where people say, I don't know if there's a God, maybe there isn't, or there's no God. Secularism is actually not an absence of faith. It's actually a new set of beliefs. It's not the absence of belief. It's a new set of beliefs. So, for example, if you ask a secular person, where did matter come from? They'll say either it generated itself or it's always been there, except we don't know any. Matter doesn't behave like that. Matter doesn't generate itself. There's no such thing as matter that has always existed beginninglessly. And so as soon as you say that, you realize there's no way to prove that. And therefore, we are all living by faith. Secularism is a whole new set of beliefs about human rationality, human purpose, the nature of the material world, moral value, etc. And everybody's got a set of beliefs about reality, and nobody can demonstrably prove that their beliefs are right. Well, then you say, does that mean that we're sort of stuck? Everybody has their beliefs. There's no way to rationally interrogate them. There's no way to actually come to a reasonable conclusion of which one is most likely true. Even if you can't prove it, is there some way to reasonably weigh these? And my answer here, and what we've been doing the answer is, I think, yes. You compare beliefs. You don't ask any one of them to prove slam dunk. What you do is you compare beliefs and you start to ask them questions like this. Which of these sets of beliefs are the most consistent with our experience? Which of these are the most consistent with the evidence? There may not be slam dunk proofs, but there's evidence, pro and for and against God, etc. Which of these beliefs is the most consistent with experience? Which of these beliefs is the most consistent with evidence? And which of these sets of beliefs is most consistent with themselves? In other words, do you have a set of beliefs that has to smuggle in values from other sets of beliefs? In other words, are they internally consistent? Each week we're taking another subject and asking that question. We're comparing different worldviews, different sets of beliefs. Sometimes we do other religions, but by and large we've been comparing Christianity and secularism. And so last week we talked about morality. This week we're going to drill down a little bit more and talk more specifically about justice and human rights. What we're actually saying is, given what we believe and know about human rights, does secularism or Christianity better support human rights? Now you say, what do you mean by support? Does secularism or Christianity better support human rights? What does it mean to support? Okay, I'll give you two ways. Which of those sets of beliefs does a better job of explaining why people have human rights? And then secondly, which set of beliefs motivates people to sacrificially give up their power and privilege in order to support human rights, equal human rights? So which set of beliefs actually fits what we know about human rights the best? So let's answer that question by asking four more questions. One is, what are human rights? That can be brief, because there's a lot of consensus about that. What are human rights? Where did the idea come from of human rights? What are the problems that right now secular society has with human rights? And what can Christianity contribute? So number one, what are human rights? Human rights are this. When a human being comes into your presence, they come with, you might say, obligations and claims. They have the right not to be silenced, not to be mistreated, not to be abused, to be treated as people of equal worth and dignity. So people come into your presence with a claim, with the right to be treated as people of equal worth and dignity. And the most important question here is, they have those rights by virtue of what? Not by virtue of their race, so that some races have rights and others don't. Not by virtue of their gender. Not by virtue of their ethnicity, but not by virtue even of their economic worth or their income potential, or even their usefulness to society, or their talents. No, everyone, that we believe, human rights mean every human being has the right to be treated as a being of equal dignity and worth, just by virtue of them being human. It has nothing to do with their race, their class, their educational level, their the ability to generate income. They have to be treated as beings of equal worth and dignity just by virtue of being a human being. Okay. Where did that idea come from? But that's the first point. And by the way, that was a very short first point, but please don't get your hopes up. Second point, where did the idea come from? Because it's a relatively new idea. And it's really arisen in the West in the last couple hundred years. So where did the idea come from? Now, what I'm about to tell you may seem, and you can ask me more about this, of course, that's what we're here to do, is you can talk back at Question Christianity, but this may seem pretty counterintuitive to the average person. But increasingly, you've got scholarship, high-level scholarship, that is saying the idea of human rights arose in Christian Europe in the late Middle Ages. And it came, they developed in the West, not in other parts of the world, because Christianity, and especially in the Bible, had several views, beliefs, doctrines, you might say, that the other cultures and societies of the world did not have. And human rights were a result of meditation on these doctrines. One of the doctrines of the Bible is the doctrine of the image of God. Because the Bible says that every single human being has been made in the image of God, reflects God in some way, and therefore is of equal preciousness. So there's places in the Bible not only that says you can't kill people because they're in the image of God, there's a place in the Bible where it says you shouldn't even curse at people because they're beings in the image of God. There is no other culture that had a belief like that. Aristotle, by the way, very famously said he believed that some people deserved to be slaves or were fit to be slaves. Aristotle thought that the more rational people deserved more honor, and therefore if you had a race that was more emotional than rational, maybe they deserved to be servants, and the rational people deserved to be the masters. And so in most places in the world, people saw very often people of other civilizations and races not as fellow human beings, but of actually different species. But the Bible said every human being is made in the image of God, every single one. That was unique. Secondly, the Bible also says that human choice matters. That other religions and cultures of the world actually believed that everything was fated, and the Greeks and the Romans believed that your choices, your decisions didn't really matter. It basically, everything was determined. But Christianity comes along, the Bible comes along and says, you're saved by your choices. You're saved by making decisions. And therefore, the ability to make a free choice, the ability of the individual to make a free choice, you can't be saved by what your family has said. You've got to make that decision, or you're not saved. You don't have a relationship with God. And that whole idea suddenly meant the individual was extremely important. So first of all, you had the doctrine of the image of God, the doctrine that human choices were significant. The third thing was that this body and this physical world was real and important. The other religions of the world, the other cultures, saw this world as really not being important. The Greeks, of course, believed that the spirit was important, the body was really not. It was a kind of a discardable receptacle of the soul. Of course, a lot of Eastern religions believe that the physical world is actually an illusion. And of course, there's not a lot of incentive to improve physical conditions of the poor and all that with that understanding. But the Bible says, no, the body is important. God made the world. He made the physical world good. He's going to resurrect and renew this physical world, and therefore how people are treated in the body matters. And one last point was that the Bible teaches that God himself is personal. He's not just this impersonal force. He's personal, and in the afterlife, we maintain our personalities. That's why John Updike has a fascinating place in his memoirs where he says one of the reasons he wants to be a Christian is he says, I believe in being a self forever. Where other religions believe, yes, the spirit goes on, but you kind of you lose your individuality. It's like a dewdrop going into the ocean. That's the Buddhist approach. And no, Christianity, the Bible always said, you are a personal self forever. And if you put all those things together, what does that mean? Larry Siedentop of Oxford University, just a few years ago, wrote a book called Inventing the Individual. And he says it was Christianity that came up with the idea that the individual is more important, that the individual has rights, that every single individual has equal rights. Brian Tierney of Cornell University, a historian, has also done a lot of work in this area and said, yeah, the idea of human rights came from the Bible. It would not have arisen without that. And by the way, atheists like Friedrich Nietzsche, and today John Gray, who's also an atheist, they all agree that if it wasn't for those biblical doctrines, the idea of human rights and individual, the importance of the dignity of the individual would never have arisen. However, okay, that's where they came from. That may seem counterintuitive. An awful lot of people say, well, I always thought the church was against human rights and it was secular people that came up with the idea of human rights. No. Now, number 3, what kind of problems does the secular world, though, have with human rights? Because the secular world is not our governments are secular. Our society is probably decreasingly Christian. That is, Christianity is declining in the West, Europe and North America, and increasingly people are secular. So how do they then figure out human rights? And of course, this is a problem. And actually, it's a big problem for the secular world. Right after World War II, the United Nations drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it's famous because it was the first time that human rights were all put down in a document with no basis for it. In other words, it didn't say God. It didn't say like the Declaration of Independence, that these inalienable rights are the gift of the Creator. It didn't do that. It just didn't talk about any basis. It just said they're just there. The implication was, you don't have to believe in God to believe in human rights. We just know that they're there. Common sense. No reason why we have to give. This is just the way it is. And this has created enormous problems in the modern world. To bring this to a kind of point, to show you, to focus this problem, let me tell you a story about a woman. She wrote an article in 1995 in the Chronicle of Higher Education. She's now retired. She was a pretty prominent cultural anthropologist at Rhode Island College. She's retired now. Pretty prominent. And her name is Carolyn Fleur-Lobban. Maybe Laban, I don't know, I'm not saying it right. Carolyn Fleur-Lobban. And she wrote a fascinating article in 1995. And what she said was, she says, as a professional cultural anthropologist, I am trained never to go into a culture and ever come in with moral judgments about the values of the culture. In other words, I come into a culture and I would never say, your culture is bad, this culture is good, what are you doing? She says, as a cultural anthropologist, I make no moral judgments about the values of any particular culture. But then secondly, as a secular person, she said, I don't believe that there's such a thing as moral absolutes. I believe that all moral values are basically constructed by the particular culture. And you believe that right and wrong, but you do it because you're part of a particular culture. And moral values are invented. They're not absolute. They're not up there in heaven. But she started doing cultural anthropology work in Africa. And when she got there and she began working, she began to see what she considered the abuses of women in many of the African cultures. And she began to talk to the powers that be. She began to talk to people in authority there about her concerns. And they pushed back in a major way. Now, I got this from somebody else. This is not actually from this article, but this is essentially, she said, this is basically what they said. They basically came to her, and they said, you say that all moral values are based on either evolutionary biology or they are culturally constructed. And on the basis of your own beliefs, it is completely inconsistent for you to say the way we treat women here is wrong. In our culture, you have your culture, we have our culture. And they go on to say, you speak as if these individualistic values that you have in the West are self-evident to all educated people. They aren't. You speak as if they are obvious to all rational people. We are rational, and you're not. These are beliefs. These beliefs about, this is what they say, these beliefs about women's rights, these are beliefs, they're simply leaps of faith, and we don't share this faith that you have in the individual, the sovereignty of feelings and choice, and your overblown belief in science to solve human problems. When you simply present these things as self-evidently true, and when you tell us only primitive and unenlightened people will not see them, then you are being just the same white Western imperialists you have always been. Okay? So the problem is, the modern secular idea of human rights is that you don't need a basis for them. We don't believe in moral absolutes, evolutionary biology, cultural construction, blah, blah, blah. We would never say, no, one culture is not any better than another culture, but then we go to other places, we see that there are people that don't do individual rights, and now, if you go in there, you are wide open to charges of imperialism. Why? Because on the basis of your own beliefs, you have no right to tell somebody of another culture that you're abusing women. No right at all. Now, what's interesting is, by the way, here's what she wrote. Listen. She said, for a long time, I felt trapped between my anthropologist's understanding of moral value and the claims of human rights. Finally, I came to realize that there is a moral agenda larger than myself, larger than Western culture, and I decided to join my colleagues from other disciplines who began to work for women's rights in Africa. But, by the way, she's a white woman, just to let you know who Carolyn Fleur-Labrin is. Then she says, however, there still is a problem. What authority do we Westerners have to impose our own concept of individual rights on the rest of humanity? But I decided that this culturally relativistic argument that I always used is now being used by repressive governments to deflect international criticism of their abuse of their own citizens, so I won't listen to it. In other words, I got no basis in my own understanding of the world to believe in universal human rights as a moral absolute for all cultures. I got no basis to do it, but I believe it anyway, and I'm going to act on the basis of it. Okay, you see the problems. It's so what if a lot of secular thinkers see that. I wouldn't say the average person in the street sees that. The average agnostic or atheist that I talk to in New York City has always said, of course there's human rights, and everybody knows that. The trouble is they've never talked to somebody from another culture who says, I'm somebody and I don't believe that. So why should I believe in human rights? Why should I believe in that? Why should I believe in equal rights for women? And all you can say is blah, blah, blah. You know? And, of course, if you're a Westerner, especially if you're a white Westerner, you're in a real pickle. Because you're doing to them the very thing that you say they're not supposed to do. Which is, you're basically trying to say, you're trying to shut them down. You're trying to say, even though I don't have any basis, my feelings take precedence over your feelings. Now, there's been 4 ways that secular thinkers in the last 30 or 40 years have been working to try to ground human rights without God. And let me give you the 4. And they're all interesting efforts. Where can you read about these? Well, just look around. There's a lot of... Alan Dershowitz of Harvard University, he's emeritus now, has written a couple books on this, but you can read them other places. There's basically 4 ways that they say, hey, you can be secular, you don't have to believe in God, image of God, we don't need that, in order to not only explain human rights, but also motivate people to support them. The one is natural law. If we just look at nature, nature itself, we don't need religion, we don't need the Bible, nature itself just tells us that human beings are equal. Now, you need to know that the earliest secular people, now we're talking about 17th, 18th century, and I got to say, pre-Darwin, there were many, many secular thinkers who said, we don't need the Bible to see the importance of the individual and the importance of equal human rights, because we can just look at nature. We'll deduce it from nature. And then Darwin came along, and Darwin says, look at nature, and nature is red in tooth and claw. Nature tells, for survival of the fittest, nature says stronger organisms eat the weaker organisms, and that's how evolution moves on. So why all of a sudden would you say, well, it's perfectly natural for the strong to eat the weak, but not for human beings? You can't do that, which means you're actually bucking natural law. So natural law won't help you. Remember last week, some of you were here, I read that fascinating passage from Annie Dillard in Tinker Creek, and she lived by a creek side, and one time she saw a giant water bug paralyze a toad, and then stick its beak down into its head and suck it out, and so just leave the toad, almost like a piece of clothing, his skin there. And Annie Dillard, she says, I have nightmares about that thing. And she says, so if I'm going to look at nature, that is not going to help me find human rights. So number two, the second thing that a lot of secular people would say is, well, human rights are just things we create. We see that society goes better if we treat everyone as equal, if we treat every human being as valuable. And so we just create human rights. Now, interestingly, by the way, Alan Dershowitz and other people have said the same thing. That is a completely useless idea, because if you really say that we create them, we don't discover them, they're not there, we create them. If we create them by majority vote, do you know what that means? They can be removed by majority vote. So if you say the majority creates them by voting them in and creating those laws, then that means, by the way, that any majority can vote to kill any minority, and no one can say boo about it. Why? Because the rights don't exist unless the majority votes it in. And therefore, what the Nazis did was fine, because it was majority. That was, Hitler was elected. He was elected. He didn't take power. He was elected. And so what basically happens is it just doesn't work. In fact, there's a great place where Dershowitz says this. He says, rights are useless unless they are discovered, not created, because the whole point of a human right, he says the value of it is that a minority can claim the rights against the majority. I mean, that's the whole point of it, is to say to the majority, look, we don't have power, but we've got rights, and you cannot just put us under your boot. So he says, if the majority can take away those rights because they actually don't exist unless the majority votes them in, well, then they're useless. So first, natural law? No. Secondly, we create them? No. Third, by the way, is an approach that says they are just capacities. This is more recent, but there's a fair number of secular thinkers who say, look, we can justify human rights. Why do we treat human beings as having rights that animals don't have, for example? Not that there aren't certain animal rights, but I mean, the point is we don't give animals the right to vote and things like that. So the point is, why justify giving humans rights that we don't give to vegetables and we don't give to animals? And the answer is they can make rational moral choices. They've got free will, not just instinct. They can consider, they can make rational choices, and therefore, because they have that rational choice capacity, human rights is just simply recognizing that and saying you need to be free to exercise that rational choice. And therefore, human rights. But maybe some of you can see the problem. Number one, a lot of older people don't have the rational ability much anymore. And by the way, newborn infants don't either. For at least a year or two, probably, or maybe longer than that. They can't make choices. And then here's the other problem, is there's a whole lot of things that have evolved in human beings. Why is this the one that gets privileged? And where's the obligation? Who says that because people make rational choices that therefore they ought to? Who says that? Well, you're actually saying it's good, it's right, you've got to. Why are you privileging freedom? That's a set of moral values that you're imposing on things. But the biggest problem, of course, is Peter Singer of Princeton University does say, because he believes human rights are based on capacities, that he doesn't have a problem with infanticide. And it's just the natural, which of course is a horrible thing, I think, but the point is, I'm not trying to say he's a horrible person, I'm just trying to say, what it does mean is if you try to ground human rights in capacities, that's where you go. Christianity grounds it in just the image of God. No matter who you are, if you're in a coma, you're still in the image of God, even though you don't have rational abilities. If you're an old person with Alzheimer's, you're still in the image of God, even though you don't have rational choice. So the natural law doesn't work. The we create doesn't work. The capacities doesn't work. I'll just tell you one more, just because it's kind of interesting. I once was on a panel. I was once having a really great discussion with a brilliant man who's not a believer in God. He's an atheist. And at one point, somebody asked him if he was a relativist. And he said, oh no, it would be terrible to say that there is no moral truth and everything is relative. He said, you couldn't have a society. He says, however, as an atheist, I'm also not a moral realist. He said, because if I was a moral realist, that means there's absolutes, and I don't know what they would possibly be. The problem with being an atheist, he said, is all we have is the material world. We don't have any supernatural standard. So how can you elevate one part of the material world and say this is good and another part is bad? It's just what it is. So he doesn't believe in moral absolutes. He's not a moral realist and he's not a moral relativist. And then he says, I'm a moral emergentist. What he says is that when the human race comes to an overwhelming consensus about something, then that actually is a moral truth now. We've come to the place where a lot of things the human race now knows on a whole are true, and therefore that's a moral absolute, even though it's emerged. And he looked at me, smiled, being a really nice guy, and said, I'll bet you think I'm really a moral relativist. And I said, yes, I do. And here's what I could have said, and I didn't. I could have said, so, sir, because we were at a place where we had a lot of young college students. There were plenty of people who didn't believe in God, plenty of people who did. And if I just said this, I said, so you were saying 1,000 years ago that slavery was fine. 500 years ago was fine because there wasn't a moral consensus about it. That's what you're saying. And he would have had to say, yes, it's wrong now, but it wasn't wrong then. He would have lost everybody in the room, including all the young atheists, who just wouldn't accept it. So look, I want to show you the Christian contribution, but here's the question. If your premise that there's no God leads you to a conclusion you know isn't true, that there really aren't any such thing as human rights, why not consider changing the premise? Or put another way, which I think maybe a little more fair, is if, like Carolyn Fleur-Lobin said, if there was a God, you would expect it to be human rights. But just because there's human rights doesn't mean there's a God, which is right. Just because there's human rights doesn't prove there's a God. Maybe they just exist. But would you at least admit or concede that if we believe in human rights, if you are here and you believe in human rights, that the existence of God explains your experience way better than the non-existence of God? That the set of beliefs that said there is a God leads you to expect human rights would be there, and the view that there is no God, as you can see in this cultural anthropologist and this man I was working with, if their beliefs really lead you to expect there are no human rights, but there are, well, whose set of beliefs makes more sense of what we actually experience? Now, the last couple of minutes I'd like to talk about what is Christianity's contribution. And you say, well, I thought you already told us. You said Christianity came with the idea. And of course, if you're a Christian and you believe in human rights, you don't have that same problem that this cultural anthropologist had. Because even if somebody rejects your belief that, women are being abused in Africa or wherever, whatever nation she was in. At least if you come and say, there's a God and the Bible is his word, and here's what the Bible says about that, and at least they may not agree with you, but at least they're not going to call you a hypocrite. I'm not going to say that you are actually undermining your own view and actually you're being deeply inconsistent. They're not going to say that. So isn't that enough? No. Because frankly, doing justice in this world is caught on the horns of a dilemma that I think Christianity uniquely helps. And what is that dilemma? Okay, on the one hand, the problem is that people who think they have the truth tend to be oppressors. Now, here I'm talking about the phenomenon called postmodernism. And 40 years ago, 35 years ago, a French philosopher, Jean-Francois Lyotard, wrote a very famous book on what is postmodernism, and he said postmodernism is incredulity, that is skepticism, about any meta-narratives. That's the word, meta-narratives. Now, what's a meta-narrative? As you can see, a meta-narrative means a grand story or a grand explanation of everything, a theory of everything, truth, capital T. And what he said is people who think they have the truth, they think they have a grand narrative, they got an explanation for absolutely everything. It leads to oppression for three reasons. Number one, people who think they have the truth, the grand narrative, the theory of everything, that explains everything. Number one, it shuts down intellectual dissent because it purports to explain everything. So we don't want to hear from you because I've got the answers to everything. Secondly, it shuts down political consent because it tends to be utopian. People who think they have the truth say, if everybody in the world just did this, all of our problems would be over. If everybody just adopted our truth, and if we can just get our policies in place, the world's going to be great. And it's utopian. So, of course, what that means is you have to shut down political dissent. But number three, Lyotard says, meta-narratives just engender a spirit of domination. If you have the truth, other people don't have the truth, you just have a sense of arrogance, and you have a sense that we don't have to listen to you, we can marginalize you, we need to marginalize you. So for all those ways, in all those ways, he says, and he's got a really good point, that people who think they have that grand theory of everything, it's oppressive. And what postmodernism did, interesting, Lyotard, for example, said that Marxism was one of those grand narratives. And he's right. Because Marxism is absolutely, it shuts down dissent because it says we've got the explanation of everything. We can explain everything in terms of unjust social structures, everything. Number two, it shuts down political dissent. It always tends, to say if we get the workers' paradise in there, everything will be fine. It has a spirit of domination. And what Lyotard says is all meta-narratives are totalizing. And what he means is they tend to totalitarianism. All meta-narratives are totalizing, which means they tend toward totalitarianism. So Marxism was one of them. By the way, capitalism was one of them, because he thinks actually the logic of the market, the idea that as long as there's complete free enterprise, as long as there's untrammeled capitalism and there's no regulations on it all, the free market will solve our problems. He says, of course, fascism is a totalitarian, is a totalizing meta-narrative, and a kind of racist nationalism. And so he has all these things. So what postmodernism would say is, nobody's got the truth. There is no meta-narrative, because they're all totalizing. They all tend to totalitarianism. Nobody's got the truth, nobody at all. And everything is relative. And this was supposed to be the way to undercut the dominant narratives, which supposedly were the source of the oppression. Marx was wrong. It's not social structures. It's the idea that there's truth. How has that worked out? Not too well, and I'll tell you why. Because here's the other horn of the dilemma. In 2011, one of the things that shocked a lot of people was that the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, which is one of the leading cultural institutions in the world, had its first, it had a show there that was called the First Comprehensive Retrospective on Postmodernism. And the name of it was Postmodernism, 1970 to 1990, as if it was over. And that year, the Chronicle of Higher Education had an article in it called "Postmodernism is Dead." Now listen carefully. And it was talking about the show, and why was it that there were so many people saying, postmodernism, we tried it for 30 years and it's not working and we're going to move on to something else. Here's what the article said. He said, postmodernism was the idea of deprivileging any one meaning. Deprivileging any one meaning. This idea that all discourses are equally valid has therefore led to some real-life gains for humankind. Because once you are in the business of challenging the dominant discourse in any particular culture, you're also in the business of giving hitherto marginalized and subordinate groups their voice, okay? But over time, a new difficulty has been created because postmodernism attacks everything. A mood of confusion and uncertainty began to grow and flourish. If we deprivilege all positions, we actually can assert no position, and therefore we cannot work for justice. And an aggressive postmodernism becomes, in the real world, indistinguishable from an odd species of inert conservatism. Looked at in this way, it's easy to see why its power has been diminishing. The postmodern salvation will no longer do as a response to the world we now find ourselves in. Do you get that? See, the real problem is if all claims of truth are power moves, and so is that, and then you have to ask yourself the question, why not keep my power? Tell me why I shouldn't keep my power. And the trouble was that postmodernism was trying to get us to a position where we could do justice, but you have no basis for it in postmodernism. In fact, Terry Eagleton, who's a British literary critic, says, postmodernism is against binaries. Don't say, I have the truth and you do not have the truth. Binaries, good, evil, binaries. We're going to get rid of that. Everybody's right, everybody's wrong. We're going to deprivilege. He says the problem is, what it does is sets up a new binary. It says, you people with the truth are bad, we relativists are good. Same thing. You've done the same thing. And Simon Critchley recently, who's an atheist, he's a British philosopher who teaches at New School here, recently wrote a book called Faith of the Faithless, in which he says, I am not happy to have to say this, but I don't see how we do justice without some belief in a transcendent divine order. How does Christianity help? You can find this online, so I'm going to give you 5 minutes on this and we're done. Richard Bauckham, Scottish professor at St. Andrews, now retired, wrote an article in a book which you can find online. It's in a kind of PDF now. It's called Reading the Bible as a Coherent Story. And it is so fascinating. His argument starts by saying this. His argument starts by saying, we need a grand narrative that once again affirms universal values while resisting their co-option by the forces of domination. He says we need a non-totalizing meta-narrative. We need a non-oppressive absolute. We have to believe in truth. We have to believe in universal values, or we get into all these, tie ourselves up in pretzels in order to even talk about justice. But it can't be a meta-narrative that turns us into oppressors ourselves, as all meta-narratives seem to do. And he suggests it's the biblical story of Jesus. Why? And here's what he says. Number one, remember the first problem with meta-narratives? In other words, they purport to answer all the questions, have all the answers, there's no room for debate. Well, here's what's interesting. He said, read the Bible and get to the book of Job. Job starts to suffer, and his friends come along and say, Job, we have all the answers. There's no way God would be letting you suffer unless you're a bad person. At the end of the book, by the way, God shows up, is furious at Job's friends, says, Job better pray for you or I'm going to smite you. But never tells anybody why Job suffered. Never tells Job, never tells the friends. Richard Bauckham says, anybody who thinks the Bible gives you all the answers just doesn't know how to read. The point of the Bible is to say, God is God and you're not. And there's tons of mystery in the Christian faith. In fact, a whole lot of you who talk to me, who are thinking about Christianity, get irritated by the fact that the Bible doesn't, there's so many things the Bible doesn't speak to. So what about this? Why does God do this? And I said, I don't know. Oh, mystery again, mystery again. Well, that's the mark of a non-totalizing meta-narrative. It doesn't have all the answers to everything, number one. Number two, it's not utopian. We do not believe the world will be what it needs to be till Jesus comes back. We have no illusions, and St. Augustine talked about this in his great book, City of God. We have absolutely no illusions that we can somehow bring in the kingdom of God before Jesus does it at the end of time. And St. Augustine would basically say that every city has two cities. New York City has got in it what he calls the city of God and the city of man. That's how he put it. The city of man is a human society based on power and exploitation. The city of God are human societies based on love and service. And the fact of the matter is that even though some cities are better and sometimes the one city gets stronger than another, every city is two cities. So get rid of your utopianism. Republicans, stop being nostalgic about the past, how much better it was than now. Liberals, stop thinking in the future, if we just get social justice in there, everything's going to be okay. No, Christianity is not utopian. But here's the third thing. Does Christianity have a spirit of domination? Does it lead that, which is what all meta-narratives seem to? And this is where Balkum is so brilliant. He starts off by saying, everywhere in the Bible, there's this pattern seen. If you read the Bible all the way through as a coherent story, you're going to see over and over again, God subverts the worldly expectations of wisdom and power by choosing the weak, the foolish, or the powerless to accomplish his purposes. Okay, for example, God's always subverting the world's understanding of power. For example, I'm going to give you a bunch of names, most of whom you probably never heard of. Trust me, they're in the Bible, okay? So, for example, in the ancient times, it was absolutely, the iron law was primogeniture, which meant the oldest son got all the family property, okay? And yet, what do you see going through? When God chooses someone to do his work, he chooses Abel over Cain, he chooses Isaac over Ishmael, he chooses Jacob over Esau, he chooses Joseph over Reuben, he chooses little David over Eliab. When he's working with women, he subverts the cultural narratives by choosing not the most beautiful or the most fertile, but Sarah over Hagar, Leah over Rachel. When he chooses little Israel over superpower Egypt. When he chooses his leaders, when Israel first gets back into the promised land and all that, he chooses, they're called judges like Jephthah, Gideon, Samuel. They're always from powerless tribes. They're always from the, generally the lower status parts of the country. Interestingly enough, when you see the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew chapter 1, where it gives you the genealogy of Jesus Christ, oh my word, not only in that patriarchal society, you never had women in those genealogies, never, only men. But there's 4 women in Jesus' genealogy, mothers of Jesus. Tamar, an incest survivor. Rahab, a prostitute. Ruth, a Moabitess, an Auslander, racial outsider. Bathsheba, who committed adultery. These are moral, racial outsiders, and yet they're mothers of Jesus. And when you get to Jesus himself, you see him always choosing to be with the lepers, choosing to be with the poor, choosing to be with the widows and the orphans, choosing to be with the tax collectors, the political outsiders, the moral outsiders. Why? Well, I guess the Bible, they just love the underdog. No. Listen carefully. In Philippians 2, it says, being in very nature God, Jesus did not hold on to his equality with the Father, but emptied himself of his glory, came down to earth, died on the cross, became a mortal human being, and now he has the name which is above every name. Did you see that? Now, when it says, being in very nature God, he emptied himself of his power and privilege, do you know what that means? If I say, being a nice guy, he helped a little old lady across the street. Being a nice guy, he helped a little old lady across the street. That's causative. Because he's a nice guy, he helped a little old lady across the street. That's what I mean. So when it says, being in very nature God, he emptied himself of his power and privilege, do you know what that means? It's the nature of God to empty himself of his power and privilege. That people who don't do that are contradicting the fabric of the universe. They're going against the grain of the universe. They're contradicting the very nature of God. And it's not just that the Bible likes underdogs. No. Over and over again, God puts in the center the person that the world puts on the periphery, and puts on the periphery the person the world puts in the center. Why? Because the way Jesus Christ saved us was through poverty, through weakness. If he'd come in strength and said, "Follow me and be like me, and you will be saved," then only us strong, those strong people who have had wonderful lives and had wonderful families and who can pull themselves together and be moral and disciplined, you'd be saved. But he didn't come like that. He didn't say, "Follow my example." He said, "I'm going to the cross, I'm going to die on the cross, I'm going to pay the debt you owe for your sins, for justice, divine justice, so that you can be saved by grace. And so those of us who are not good can be saved too." In other words, Jesus Christ saved us through losing his power, and therefore has the name of which above every name, meaning there is a way of getting power and influence, but through service. It's through laying aside your privilege and power and serving others in love. And therefore, what if the absolute is a man dying on the cross for his enemies, saying, "Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing"? How can you bring that, if that's your moral absolute, if that's the absolute truth, T, capital T, to the degree to which you understand that, you cannot be an oppressor. You can work for justice, of course, but it can't make you an oppressor. And if there's Christians who are oppressors, they're not looking at the very heart of their own truth. So, time up. At the very end, what Richard Bauckham says, which is, I think, a great way to end, all I got to do is find it, is where he says, "The gospel of Jesus Christ provides a non-oppressive absolute truth, one that provides a norm outside us as a way of escaping the ineffectiveness of relativism and of selfish individualism, yet one that cannot be truly used to oppress others."
All right, Tim, you ended with highlighting that Christianity is a non-oppressive absolute truth, that if Christians become oppressors, they're rejecting what's at the heart of their faith. But, question, why have so many religious people, including Christians, done so much injustice?
Well, I mean, there's no good excuse. So I'm afraid if I give you an explanation, I can give you explanations, but it's going to sound like an excuse, and you mustn't read it as that. I really don't want to take any blame away. An explanation is not the same as a justification. Is that all right? So I'm going to take this as a genuine request for information. How can that happen? If one of the on the outside of Christianity, if you're outside, that is, say you're not Christian, you don't believe in Christianity, you may hear somebody say, "Well, Christians are saved by grace alone. They're saved not because of their good works, but just because of God's forgiveness." And you may hear people say that's very different than other religions, because every other religion says you achieve salvation, or you touch the divine, or you connect to God through a number of things you must do, living in a certain way. In a sense, you merit or you earn your salvation. And Christianity says, no, it's not earned, it's a gift, it's received. Now, I've noticed over the years that even though a person who is not actually on the inside and embraced Christianity, if you're outside and you hear that, it doesn't seem to be all that radical. I mean, they say, yeah, you get forgiven. But you probably think that that really Christianity still is basically trying to live like Jesus, and that's what a Christian is. No, it's not. In fact, you can't be a Christian. You will not. Historically, Christian theology would be to say, you are actually not born again, or you're not converted, or you haven't received the Holy Spirit, or you haven't had God really come into your life, or whatever you want to say. As long as you really think that being a Christian is trying to be a good person and live like Jesus, it really is for people who are willing to admit they're not good people and that they have no hope without a complete Savior, okay? What that means then, of course, is when people do not come into Christianity because they have achieved something, they come in because they haven't achieved something and they're willing to admit that. Therefore, over the years, most people say, if you claim to be a Christian, you really ought to be a better person than everybody else. And therefore, I should hold you to a higher standard. And whenever I hear that, I'm ambivalent, because to some degree, of course, the Bible is filled with saying, if you really have been saved by grace, it's going to change your life eventually. But the point is, you don't clean up your life to become a Christian. You come as you are. And therefore, there's a whole lot of broken people that come into Christianity, and they really aren't very far along the road to growth. And I would say that because of that, I just see plenty of immature behavior in real Christians, but they are real Christians. Somebody from the outside might say, well, how can that be a real Christian? Look at how they're behaving. They still have a terrible temper. They still speak so intemperately at work. And they're supposed to be a born-again Christian. Well, the answer is, on the one hand, yes, they have to change. There's no excuse for that. In many, many ways, they have less excuse than they ever have because Christ is in their life. On the other hand, they're not saved by cleaning up their act. And so what I'm trying to say is it's not a justification, it's an explanation. Christians are actually not only, I would say, not on the whole paragons of virtue, but in many ways they're the people who are willing to admit that they're not. Some years ago, I heard a minister say this, and I think he's right. He says, the main thing for most people between, he would say the biggest barrier, he thinks, between human beings and God is not your sin, but it's your damnable good works. And what he means by that is that the point of Christianity is to say, you've got to see that even the good things you've done are really not all that good. You've done them for bad motives, you've done them to control people, you've done them to patch up an identity for yourself, you've done them to try to get God to make you, to bless you and that sort of thing. And he would actually say, people who think that they're pretty good actually have the biggest problem with Christianity. People who are finally willing to admit their moral failures, they've got a door right on in. What that does mean is that there's really a fair number of broken people in the Christian faith. And therefore, all I know is over the years as a pastor, I've often had a lot of folks who are really not behaving like they should, and people who are not in the church looking at that and saying, there's your Christianity. And on the one hand, the answer is, yeah, there's Christianity. That you can actually have a love relationship with Jesus Christ and be an incredibly imperfect person. There it is, that's great. On the other hand, there it is, and it's a little embarrassing. So I'm trying to give you an explanation for why a lot of Christians misbehave without trying to justify it at all.
Speaking of imperfect people, I think this is a good follow-up question to what you just said.
Do you have somebody in mind?
Not somebody in mind, maybe years of church practice. If the idea of human rights comes from Christianity, as you claimed, then why, during the first 1,500 years of the church's history, did the church not have it?
Well, boy, nobody exactly had it, even though the church. Look, there was a guy named, I think I might have mentioned this last week, maybe not. It's hard to remember. I speak a lot of places. Did I mention the Cappadocian Fathers last week? I think I did. Some of you might know. Basil the Great and Gregory of Nyssa and Gregory. They lived in the 4th or 5th century. They were Greek Orthodox Christians. I mean, they were bishops, and they were brilliant philosophers and theologians. And they began to tease out a lot of the implications of what the Bible said about the image of God. And they'd never used the word human rights, but actually, even back then, even in the early church, you can already find sermons. One of them, I'll give you a perfect example. Basil has a very famous sermon in which he says, slavery is always wrong because slaves are bought. And he says, how could you put a price tag on the image of God? And then he used a couple of, last time I read it, there's a whole lot of, their financial currency. One of them was the obol, O-B-O-L, okay? Who would have thought? And he says, how many obols for the image of God? And so he was saying the implication of the image of God is you must never actually ever have a slave. So he's working out the implications of what's in the Bible. And some people would say that they were one of the first people in the history of the world to kind of start to work out a doctrine of human rights. So it took time, but again, the raw material was in the Bible, where it wasn't in a lot of other cultures. And so I'm trying to get you to give the Bible credit, but the church certainly didn't always understand the implications of what they believed.
I'm getting a lot of questions about how justice and Christianity intersect in the political sphere. This question was actually asked ahead of time, sent in online when someone registered, and it says, why do Christians align themselves with Republicans who aren't focusing on social issues such as child homelessness, poverty, and hunger? I find it strange that hot-button issues like marriage rights and abortion sway Christian politics instead of compassion.
Well, I don't think it's my job to. I'm here trying to represent Christianity. Period. I don't think it's my job to. For example, should a nation have an immigration policy? Should it have an immigration policy? I think most people would say, yeah, there ought to be some. A nation ought to have borders, and therefore, not everybody should be able to walk over it, and there should be some orderly way of receiving immigrants. Okay. On the other hand, and so, is America's immigration policy okay? Is it broken? What should it be? It's not my job to tell you. However, because as a Christian, I don't know. I mean, and the Bible doesn't speak to that, and it's my job to kind of tell you what the Christian truth is. But the Bible does talk about racism. It does talk about, in fact, the Bible actually goes out of its way to say you must not oppress the alien, the immigrant. You must not despise them. You must embrace them, and da da da. So if there's a public policy, and in here I'm trying to be careful because I don't want to be, I don't want to get beyond what the you have to apply this. But the point is, if you have a party, for example, that's promoting negative attitude towards immigrants in general and negative attitudes toward people of other races in general, that's wrong. And on the other hand, my guess is that the Christians who are involved with, here's the problem. So I am saying, on the other hand, keep this in mind that both parties have ethical packages, as you know. If you want to run to be a Republican or run to be, for a Democrat, you can't just say, "Well, this is my issue." They'll shoot you down unless you're with them on all the issues. So you might be what if I'm a Christian, and I say, "Well, I'm pro-life, okay, but I'm also really for gun control, and that's partly part of my pro-lifeness. I'm really for gun control. So where do I go? I got a problem. I really do have a problem." And I think I hope most Christians would see that. I guess you may know that I'm on record in saying this, is I am actually very unhappy when Christians tend to so embrace one party that they give the impression, or they overtly say, all Christians must belong to this party. I don't see how you can do that. I think that's actually a form of idolatry, where you're lifting up something human and putting it kind of into a divine place. The only other thing I'll say, and I'm rambling a little bit because there's too much to say about this, is so when you say, what about Christians that are all into the Republican Party and they act like only Christians should all be Republican? I have a problem with that. On the other hand, I actually also have a problem with people who say Christians can't be Republican and they have to be Democrats because of all these moral issues. And by the way, there's plenty of people out there in social media saying that too. I would be against them both. Keep this in mind. It doesn't undermine the truth of Christianity. I'm here to try to get you to consider Christianity as a real option for yourselves. And so whenever you look, I might say that, okay. Whenever you look at the inconsistencies of Christians and you criticize them, keep in mind that to a great degree you're criticizing them for not living up to Christian standards. In other words, when you talk about injustices when the church has oppressed people, you're really actually using Christian standards to criticize them. Rightly so. With warrant, you are saying, you're not living up to your own standards. Fair. No excuses. But you see, you're not undermining the truth of Christianity, are you? Because you're actually using Christianity on the church. Do you see that? Rightly so. You say, the Bible says this, the Bible says this. How in the world can you be for that? How can you do that? How awful is that? I don't mind. Beat them up. Go ahead. As long as you see you're using Christian standards against the church, which is fair, but that doesn't undermine the standards, does it? It doesn't really. Because you like the standards, otherwise you wouldn't be using it on them. So trying to make no excuses for these things, but at the same time trying to show that it should not undermine Christianity as a viable option for you.
I think that is a good explanation but I do think the question is also trying to ask, why is it that Christians and the Republican Party tend to maybe more concerned with certain issues and less concerned with others? I think this question is trying to get at if Christians are pursuing the Republican Party, they don't seem to have as much of a care for poverty, child poverty, homelessness, but seem to care more about marriage rights and abortion.
But I think it's that's just too sweeping to say. Now keep this in mind. I certainly have seen people who say, let the poor fend for themselves. But it's also true that people disagree on how you help the poor, right? I hope you see that. In fact, I will say, here's something interesting. Marxism says that if a person is poor, it's only because of social structure. If they're poor, it's not their fault. It's unjust social structure. You must never blame the victim. You must never say they're poor because they're this or that. It's always an unjust social structure. That's the Marxist approach. It's a philosophical anthropology of Marxism, is to say that human beings are ultimately economic and social creatures, and therefore everything can be explained by their social location. All right. The conservative approach is to say, if you're poor, it's your fault. As long as it's a free country, as long as you can get out there and work, it's your fault. It's your values, it's your irresponsibility, it's your laziness. You get into crime, it's your fault. So on the one hand, you say poverty is because of social structure, and the other hand, you say poverty is because of a lack of personal responsibility. Now go to the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament and read everything it says about poverty. And you know what it's going to say? Let me give you two proverbs, okay? One proverb is that if you work, you always have something to eat. Oh. Now, by the way, proverbs are not necessarily promises. They're observations. So if you go to Proverbs 10, 11, 12, that's mainly what you see. Work hard and you'll avoid poverty. Work hard and you'll have things to eat. Then you get to a place where it says, the field of the poor is filled with grain, but injustice sweeps it away. And you go, wait a minute, what? I thought it said that you have to remember that the Proverbs are not promises and they're not laws, they're observations about how life works. And what it's trying to tell you is that both, frankly, and even today, there's no doubt about it that Republican policy tends to talk less about social structural issues and tends to spend more time thinking about personal responsibility when it comes to trying to help the poor. And the Democratic Party tends to favor the Marxist approach. It's mainly social structure. And the Bible just it diagonalizes. I don't know if you heard that term before. In other words, what the Bible does is it both contradicts both parties, and it also doesn't ignore the concerns of either, because the reality is poverty is more complicated than either party lets on. So as a Christian now, what am I supposed to do? Please don't tell me that if I go to the Republicans, I just absolutely hate the poor. That's just not fair. It could be there's people there who hate the poor or just despise the poor. Could be. And by the way, I've met some who I think did pretty much despise the poor. But I don't think it's fair at all to say that. On the other hand, I don't think you would say to any Democrat, that they don't believe in personal responsibility. But the fact is that both the parties, left and right, tend to be reductionistic. The Bible is three-dimensional. The Bible is way more nuanced. And as a Christian, I don't have a nice, easy, answer to which party I should be in. I just don't. On that area of poverty, I don't.
All right, so continue on a little bit on this path. Multiple questions about Christians themselves, again, claiming that Christianity is responsible for influencing the creation of human rights, and that Christians have a unique resource to live out human rights and justice. This person asks, how do you explain the human rights abuses of the American church to the LGBTQ community?
Well, when Jesus Christ, there's no excuse for that either. Now, by the way, for example, I should say the second, not first. First, when Jesus Christ is asked, what does it mean to love your neighbor? He tells the parable of the Good Samaritan. The parable of the Good Samaritan is about a man who's a Samaritan who comes along and sees a man who's a Jew in the road. It would be very risky to stop and help this man who's been beaten up and who needs medical help and he needs money. And it's very risky, but the Good Samaritan stops, risks his life, goes into, it really basically gives a lot of practical help, very self-sacrificing. And the Samaritans and the Jews hated each other. They were not only of two different races, they were two different religions. So Jesus Christ, when asked, what does it mean to love your neighbor? Gives us an example of someone who sacrificially helps someone of a different race and of a different religion. And these are people that hated each other. And Jesus Christ basically says that that's not supposed to be an outlier. That's the essence of what it means to love your neighbor. Now, all I can say is if Jesus is not saying both the religions are right. He's not saying that. He's not saying, well, I guess the Samaritans, they had their own religion. Samaritans are okay, Jews are okay, he's not saying that. What he's just trying to say is you need to love each other. Whether or not you think the other person's a heretic, whether or not that person is of a different race, whether that person even is an enemy. Okay, now under those circumstances, let's grant for a second that Christians believe that homosexuality is wrong because of what the Bible says. For a minute, let's just say that's what Christians believe. It's what most Christians believe. Does that give them any warrant to even be cold to a gay person? I mean, here's Jesus trying to say, what does it mean to love your neighbor? It means going to the mat for them. So abuse, ridicule, being cold. I mean, even if a gay person has a very different view of morality than a Christian, there is absolutely no excuse. Now, having said that, I'm trying to say you don't have to agree with somebody in order to love them. And I think that goes both ways. I don't want to say to a gay person, in order to love me, you've got to accept what I say about the Bible's view of sexual morality, and you shouldn't have to expect me to agree with you. On the other hand, because that's exactly what happens. There's no way that the Good Samaritan necessarily converted to Judaism in order to love that man. So all I can say is there's absolutely no excuse, period. That's it.
All right, switching gears a little bit. This person says, you said that we can't put your faith in human reasoning to ensure human rights, that we need a supernatural absolute to justify them. But don't we rely on the Bible to give us information about what God says, and don't we need human reasoning to interpret the Bible? So are we just back at the same place that we are with the secularists, in that we are relying on human reasoning to justify human rights?
Yeah, no, because if you say there is a standard, in other words, there's a God, and He has spoken, and there's our standard for moral absolutes. We can argue about what the Bible says, and we can come to different positions on it, but there's nothing inconsistent about saying there's moral absolutes. We have to use our human reason to understand the Bible. Yes, but we're not using human reasoning to create the Bible. In other words, we're using human reason to understand the moral absolutes, but we're not using human reason to concoct them, just to pull them out of the air. And I think that's a big difference.
Okay. This person says, if Christianity is so poorly understood by so many people, isn't that indicative that it's not a successful belief system?
Yeah, it's just better than the other ones.
That's his vote. He's cast it.
No,
All right.
I mean, I think that's fair to say.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, by the way, atheism has a horrible record of totalitarianism, too. I'll put it this way. There is something This is, I knew you would be asking these questions. They're great questions. They're absolutely warranted. And they are really the hardest questions for somebody like me to answer. Because there's no way to, I'm trying to give you explanations. So it's the inconsistencies of Christians are not completely opaque and utterly I want them to be a little more understandable, but at the same time, it sure sounds like I'm justifying it. I don't want to. But read the question again. It was.
If Christianity is so poorly understood by
right.
so many, isn't that proof that it's an unsuccessful belief system?
Right. There's something in the human heart that really tends to oppression and violence. It's very strong. That's the reason why Leotard said that anybody who thinks they have the truth tends to become an oppressor so fast. The real problem, of course, is being a postmodernist or being a relativist or being an atheist or whatever that you are. You have a terrible record. There's just everybody does, and therefore I would say. In fact, there's Karen Armstrong wrote a book recently about what about the myth of religious violence, and she was saying people tend to say that religion tends to violence, and she goes through history and actually shows that people have a tendency for violence, and that even Christianity, granted for a minute that it's true, even Christianity actually isn't a magic bullet. It's not a silver bullet. It's not a magic pill or something. It still tends to break through even with Christians as well. On the other hand, you do, again, we're here to compare. See, what I'm trying to say to you, if you really say, Christianity, look at all the oppression, that sort of thing, where are you going to go? See, you can't be without beliefs. And if you go to secularism or atheism or something like that, if you go in that direction, atheist regimes have a horrible record. So it's not exactly like you can just be in limbo somewhere. That's why my original joke, I like to stand by my original joke. Yes, it's not a very successful belief system, but it's better than the other ones.
Well, thank you guys so much. We have time for one more question, and thank you for sending in the question. I'm so sorry we couldn't get to so many, but please remember, right after this, Tim is going to be upstairs on the 5th floor, and we hope you'll join us for food and drinks and conversation. There'll also be some other staff, Christianity group leaders, and Tim. So again, thank you again for the questions, and please do join us upstairs to continue the conversation. So Tim, we're going to end with this question. We've highlighted a lot of failures of the church, people not accessing the resources of Christianity. But this question, I think, is related to what happens if we do, or people try to access what Christianity claims to offer. This person asks, does loving sacrificially, like Christ, entail that I would be treated like a doormat?
No, actually, I'll give you two answers, though I see the time is up and we need to end here. But first of all, the most unloving thing you can do for somebody is to let them sin. So, honestly, if someone is being verbally abusive to you, the reason you shouldn't just sit there and take it is what? Would you say you have too much self-respect? You got to protect yourself. You can't let yourself be treated like this. You have more dignity and self-respect than can allow that. Yes, of course, you're in the image of God, but the point is, it is really unloving to that person just to let them do that. It's unloving to everybody in the world, because if you just let that person do it and you don't confront them, they're going to do it to somebody else. They may do it to somebody else anyway, but there's no chance of them ever improving. There's no chance of them ever getting self-control. There's no chance of them becoming better themselves unless you confront them and you say, I'm not going to let you do this. Why? The Christian answer is out of love for them, out of love for everybody else in the human world, because that person, you're going to try to stop them for the love of other people. You're going to try to stop them for the love of them. And of course, out of respect for yourself. But frankly, I have to tell you, if you actually do it mainly for yourself, you will do a bad job of confronting that person, because instead of trying to stop their sin out of love for them, you'll be paying them back. And therefore, I think that's all I'm going to say at this point. No, absolutely not. It would be so unloving to oppressive people and to the rest of the world to let yourself be a doormat.
Thank you for listening today. Gospel in Life's ministry is supported by generous partners all over the world. Your gifts allow us to share the gospel message with millions of people through our podcast, radio, and other channels, including here on YouTube. We're seeing God change lives through the increasing reach of this ministry, so thank you for your part in it. If you'd like to make a gift today, go to gospelinlife.com/YouTube, and we'll send you one of my books as thanks for your gift. Thank you again for your generous support, because the gospel really does change everything.